Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Mr. Alan Kelly, who is a strategist, author, lecturer, political analyst, and award-winning Silicon Valley entrepreneur. He is founder and principal of Playmaker Systems, LLC, a Bethesda, Maryland-based strategy and analytics firm. Kelly's work is driven by a simple idea that influence, like chemistry, biology, and even music, can be decoded and managed through a standard system of unique units. He holds an MA in communication research and a BA in public relations. Alan Kelly, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you. I'm here to be joined into the melting pot, the chemical fusing of these cognitive crucibilized things. It's very daunting.
All right. Well, then be prepared to get run through the crucible and examined from every possible angle. So, Alan, could you, for our audience, give just a little bit more about your extensive background and career?
Sure. I'm, Silicon Valley born and bred communications and marketing guy, and did my undergraduate work at USC in public relations and journalism, and then I did my graduate work in communication research at Stanford. And for the good part of my career, I essentially have operated as an advisor, a strategist, a PR agency CEO, and have been, greatly intrigued by the immaturity, in a way, of those two disciplines, communications and marketing. I'm the son of a cell biologist. I like to say my late father, taught me, to think about systems and the scientific method and asking critical questions. And being in those fields has never been quite satisfying. So, that sort of background has led me to the work that we'll discuss. But basically, I'm a sort of retired or communications guy looking for science and method behind what is becoming, a very, very important function in our world, whether it's military or it's private, commercial, or otherwise.
Great. The discussion I'd like to have with you today is going to center around your co-authored piece entitled Decoding Crimea, Pinpointing the Influence Strategies of Modern Information Warfare. And you co-authored this with another Cognitive Crucible guest, Dr. Christopher Paul of the RAND Corporation. This piece came out quite recently. It looks like it was sponsored by NATO, and I'd love you to talk a little bit more about that. But your piece begins, and let me read this quote from it. Quote, "In matters of modern warfare, information is the rediscovered munition. Like a physical asset, a boot, bayonet, or battalion, information can be managed and maneuvered for imperious or peaceful potential. It's not kept in a casing or fired through a barrel, but its impact and persuasive effects are now inarguable." Could you talk a little bit about the impetus behind your Crimea piece and use that quote that I just read to help set the stage a little bit about strategic communications?
Sure. Well, I think, as I was saying, just in explaining my background, that I've generally known that there's a whole lot more there than just spinning and rhetoric and messaging and persuasion, that there's a method to the madness, in the world of diplomacy and stratcom, in IO, there's so many hybridized terms.
Right.
There's the frequent cry to try to win hearts and minds, and that's not unlike so many cries that happen in the private sector as well. On Madison Avenue, we're trying to figure out how to persuade people and bend them to our will, bring them around to a point of view, promote a brand, and so it's occurred to me, and I've wondered what's below that. It has seemed to me up to, and this is why I do the work that I do, it seemed to me that anybody who is in the business of influence or in the industries of influence, whether or not you're selling shoes or you're selling a policy, or you're writing a press release, or you're trying to decode some non-state actor's tweet, that there are things going on there that have much more structure than is immediately visible. So that is why I've essentially bet my career on the development of a system which is developed in the tradition of a phylogenetic tree if you're a biologist, or a periodic table of chemical elements if you're a chemist. I think that there are units, knowable, sortable, organizable, discrete units of influence, which can be used to understand the moves, the counter moves of what I call play action, or in other words, of the influence environments that we confront, whether or not I'm thinking about a client of mine that's in the fixed wireless space, or whether or not you are in the Ukraine parliament trying to figure out what Putin is doing. I think that there's a common system that can speak to all of that. Again, whether or not you're selling shoes, or whether or not you're writing a campaign speech for a political candidate, or anything in between, there really has got to be, at this point, for as important as influence is, and there really needs to be some common framework that we can understand the row and the seat number of what in the world is going on around us.
Right, for sure. So your piece obviously centers around Russia's 2014 actions in Crimea and the Ukraine. And we will have a link to this piece in the show notes. I encourage all of our listeners to go and check that out. You try to examine a number of questions. For example, was Russia successful? What were they trying to accomplish? Is it possible to make inferences about their military and political objectives? Are these kinds of playbooks reproducible? On and on. A whole bunch of really interesting questions for the information environment. I don't necessarily want to take on these questions one by one, but could we zoom back out to a strategic view, and would it be possible for you to give a little bit more of a formal definition or a direct discussion about what exactly is strategic communications, or stratcom? And this can be both in a military context or in the corporate context. What is strategic comms, and how does it fit into the big picture?
It's a great question, because I think strategic communications does enjoy different definitions. My definition is that strategic communications is a way of describing, is a housing that articulates how messaging and rhetoric and persuasion and words are used for competitive advantage. Now, in the commercial world, in the private sector, people would disagree with that. They would say, no. Communications is used to create mutual understanding. And they'll talk about all sorts of ideas of symmetric, two-way, equal exchanges. I don't think so. I think strategic communication at the end of the day is about gaining some relative advantage in some space where communications is used. Strategy is inherently a competitive construct. It wouldn't exist if you didn't have some need to retain or maintain or advance or promote some position or point of view. So to me, Stratcom is all about actually control and offense. Now, but the funny thing is that in the private sector, as well as I would say in the military, it is generally regarded though as with much softer interpretation to create that mutuality, to win that heart and mind. But I think it's sort of a euphemism, frankly. I think communications at the end of the day, however it's used, is to get some actor or some player ahead or in control. You might be mutual in doing that, but really the bottom line is to strategically advance your agenda.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I'd like to turn to your taxonomy of influence strategies. And again, for the audience, we will have a link to this in the show notes. And I encourage everyone, maybe right now, hit pause for just a second and go check out this taxonomy. It is, my opinion, a brilliant effort to catalog influence strategies. It very much resembles the periodic table of elements. It's extremely well organized and thoughtfully organized to try to illuminate the influence space. And it's one of those web pages where, depending on your level of interest, you could spend a lot of time investigating this taxonomy of influence strategies. But I'd like, Alan, if you could please give a 101 overview, or it doesn't have to be 101, it can be a 401 overview of your taxonomy of influence strategies. It's fascinating. And again, in order to appreciate this, you really do need to see it. But Alan, please take it away and try to connect up this taxonomy with your Crimea piece.
Sure. Go to playmakersystems.com, playmakersystems.com, and on the homepage, you'll see an orange button. And if you click on that, you'll go straight to the taxonomy, which is interactive. And as you float around on any of the elements on the table, you'll begin to see definitions of the strata and then there are 3 different strata in the table. And if you click on any of those tiles or those icons, which we call plays, or more formally influence strategies, then you'll see that there's quite a lot of information that is known and knowable about each of these elements of influence. The table is organized. There are various ways it can be organized, but this, I think, is the most exhaustive and the most sensible. But my point is that if you are influencing, you are always in one of 3 categories. You're either conditioning, which is the left-hand large column, or you're controlling, which is in the middle, or you're confronting. And you might notice already there's a real difference between conditioning something and confronting something. In other words, as you move from the left side of the table to the right side of the table, the plays or the strategies that are described become more emphatic, that are essentially for higher engagement situations that you've undertaken or that you're seeing or describing or which are happening to you. So from left to right, from conditioning, controlling, confronting, your level of engagement is increasing. And you might see, if you look at the plays, there's a play called a ping, which is a bit colloquial. It's unusual to have colloquial terms, but it's such a perfect term. When you ping somebody, you're sort of raising an eyebrow, if you will. Well, that's very suggestive. That's very subtle. But if you go to the right, there's a peacock. Well, that's pretty overt, right? So from the subtle to the overt, from left to right. Now, vertically, these elements here are organized according to transparency, so that the plays on the bottom, like a decoy, you'll see in dark green, also sometimes called a red herring or feint or ruse in military terms, is a whole lot less transparent than, let's say, a play called disclose, which exists at the top of that column. When you're disclosing something, you're volunteering. You say, hey, I'm here to admit that I've had an affair, or something bad about yourself. So there's no mistaking when you're using that strategy of disclosure versus when you're trying to fake out somebody by throwing the fabled rotted herring into the bush that a hunting dog would go pursue, if you understand the metaphor.
Yeah.
So at any rate, from left to right, that's engagement. From top to bottom, it's transparency. And you're always operating in one of the three: condition, controlling, or confronting. Now, each of those categories, sometimes we call classes, break down into two subclasses. Over in the left, for instance, if you're conditioning, then it's the view of the table that you're either probing or you're framing. Framing is very well known in political circles, especially. I think often in military, it's thought of as shaping. But either way, you're engaging in subtle forms of influence. By probing, you're trying to figure stuff out. You're listening, you're testing, you're pinging, you're pausing. By framing, you might be labeling something or someone. You might be informing, just straight information, or you might be invoking, which is a very, very popular and common influence strategy where you're trying, if I'm a luxury brand car maker, I'm trying to invoke notions of affluence, for instance, or coolness or popularity or richness. And then there's the filter, which is also a very, very common play where you're editing and omitting. In a way, if you're in influence, that play, the filter, is one that seems like it's almost always on. Because if you're influencing, how can you not be choosing the things that you want to say and do and reflect and sorting out others that you don't? But at any rate, the point here is that within each of these classes, there are two subclasses, which break down into then the discrete elements of the table, of which there are 23. And then if you click on any of them, you'll see quite a lot of information. You'll see related terms. You'll see the upsides and the downsides, the positive effects, the negative effects that are generally known about these plays. I have great respect for nuance because influence and communication and information always happen in highly tailored, highly individualized contexts. However, having been at this for a while, it's pretty clear that each of the influence strategies have certain home truths and so some basic characteristics that practitioners should know about them and can use. So there are known, upsides to the play called the peacock, and there are known downsides to the play called the ping, and everybody in between. So that's a little bit, that's a quick tutorial on how it's structured. But it's my view, it's the ambition of this system to have in one place all of the strategies that are foundational to the undertakings or the pastimes of communications, of marketing, media, military, government, politics, sales, any of the industries of influence. And John, one thing I think I might want to point out is if any of the listeners are on this page right now looking at the table, if you scroll down at the bottom, it's sort of a geek level thing here, but this, if I judge this audience correctly, this is a pretty bright group. And one of the things that I think should be said is that in order for any of these 23 plays to make it to the table, to the taxonomy, they have to satisfy 4 tests. The first being that they have to be unique. They have to embody some single principle of influence. Second, they have to be strategic. They have to describe an approach, a method, a motive, a plan, which is strategy. They have to be causal, meaning that their effects, outtakes, and outcomes and perceptions, not a result. And finally, fourth, they have to be intangible, meaning that they exhibit predominantly some abstract property, nothing physical. And that takes us into this notion that what I think this displays and exhibits is essentially a periodic table for the non-kinetic people, which is IO, which is PSYOPs, which is MISO, which is public diplomacy, which is STRATCOM. The people on the soft side of war and of conflict haven't had up to this point a framework that tells them what they are doing, the strategies that they're employing. We all know if you're dropping bombs and you're driving tanks, thanks to Clausewitz and others, we all know what those are, but we don't really know, what the operational units are of the public information officer, or of the PSYOPs operative, or the person who's dealing with words and dealing with things which are non-physical or non-kinetic.
Okay, fantastic. That's a terrific recap of the taxonomy. Can you take that discussion and overlay it onto the study that you just published and help connect the dots between the taxonomy and what you believe the Russians were actually doing back in the 2014 timeframe?
Yeah, we analyzed, again, from this primary source, this paper from Rand, a lot of different passages and snippets of prose and messages that were known to have been used by the Russians. And so by knowing the system, as we do, then we coded them. What we found out is that, and we coded, it looks like, somewhere around 30 or 40 different messages, not a lot, very low N. So I won't tell you that the resolution on this is high. But again, it demonstrates, by doing that, what we started to see were a couple of very interesting clusters. This is, if you're following the paper, this is on page 18. But basically, we saw that there is sort of a bimodal property to our findings, in that we found out that there's a cluster of plays that are very high transparency and very high engagement. In other words, that live on the upper right corner of the taxonomy. And so this includes the play called Contrast, and the play called Declare, and the play called Call Out, and a little bit of peacocking and a little bit of conceding. But these are primarily pressing and provoking plays that live in that category of confrontation. So very obvious and very fairly aggressive. And then there was a slightly looser constellation, clearly visibly separate, that were more the opposite in the lower left-hand corner, which means that they were low transparency and low engagement plays, like, for instance, the filter, the recast, the decoy, the invoke, very, very heavy in framing. And so what this tends to mean is that what surprised us is that this did not really fit what we think of as the usual Russian heavy-handed, non-subtle, MO. What we saw were examples that, at least in the case of Crimea and the annexation thereof, is that at times they were being subtle, and at times they were being more typical. At times they're saying, they're trying to be cordial and what I call high fit in their strategies. And other times they were more obvious and, as expected, more what I call high friction. So again, we're able to use the system to literally visualize the nature of a particular player. Now, this is just one view of one player in one scenario, of course, and And you can or probably should look at it from the Ukrainians' perspective, from the Western perspective, from NATO perspective, in order to get a full flavor of what was really going on. But in this case, at least, it surprised us that this showed that Putin and company aren't just heavy-handed. They can be very subtle when they want to. They're practicing, and they're probably getting better and better at it.
Right. And hearkening back to the discussion that I had with your colleague, Dr. Chris Paul, and listeners can go back and check out that discussion as well. Chris made the point that successful influence operations can be extremely chaotic. It doesn't have to be so curated. In fact, chaos or disinformation, the fire hose of falsehood, as Chris calls it, is surprisingly successful in your taxonomy, and this analysis of Crimea hints at that, in that there are a surprising array of influence techniques that are coming together in a overall campaign.
Yeah, I think what the big difference here, I think influence strategy in this system I'm describing is a whole lot harder for actors of democracies than actors of, let's say, non-democracies, because we bound ourselves by higher standards of ethics, and that makes it, to put it in my lexicon, it's harder to run plays if you essentially are committed to fair play. It's harder,
right?
But let's just face it: the Russians and others, I'm thinking of China or Iran or whatever, they are not dedicated to that. They don't care. And when you don't care, like, let's say, just comparing, let's say, PETA versus some corporation that does animal testing, take it into the private sector. It's a real problem, animal research and testing, when you've got an NGO that'll just do anything, that'll throw anything against any wall, like the Russians will in Crimea, and versus a corporation which has very specific laws and rules it has to abide by. So it's almost as though when Americans or Western players or democratic players engage in influence strategy, we're playing with one arm behind our back. This system doesn't necessarily help us play better, but at least it explains why it's so damn hard to win hearts and minds against rhetorical anarchists like the Russians and Putin.
Right. Perhaps you have examined this already, or maybe this would be a hypothesis. Would you say that corporate communications tend to reside more on the left-hand side of your taxonomy, where the influence, the marketing, the messaging is less confrontational and tends to be, what are the words on your taxonomy? More probing and framing and less controlling and less confrontational.
Yes, they are. Corporations generally play what I call a more left-sided game. Okay. Now, there are exceptions to that. Let's say if you go into tech, which is younger and less regulated, though not for long, because, but generally, you'll see them play a more conservative game, particularly let's say we're talking about the insurance industry, or maybe those which are maybe the financial industry. They just have to be so much more careful. So yeah, they'll probe and they'll frame to the extent they'll go right, if you will. They won't go provoke and run those red plays, but they might run pressing plays, which is sort of a nice way for doing tough, aggressive bidding, but still being nice. you can look at all sorts of constituencies. I have to laugh every time. I've done a lot of business in Germany, and I kind of snicker when I go and work in Germany because they are very, very factual. They're very factually based and caving to stereotypes. And so they tend to be not so much left-sided players, but are very, very interested in specific plays like the contrast play, which is a pressing play. But are very steeled toward not diverting and not freezing. But if you go toward Latin America, I don't know, all stops are off. There's something about Latin Americans that I've worked with that are much more willing to engage in the controlling elements where you are actively diverting and freezing some form of rhetoric. And like I say, if you're an NGO, trying to go out and prove a point or make a protest, you're also happy to divert and to freeze versus your corporate enemies, which just don't feel that they can do that.
That's outstanding. How do you envision this taxonomy getting deployed? Or if you were king for a day and you were able to convince somebody to adopt this, what are some ways that DoD or a corporation could adopt this and deploy it? What intelligence could they get from it? How could they improve their messaging strategies, et cetera?
All sorts of ways. First, I think it's a very good basis for simulation. Now, simulation, of course, is a very well-developed skill and discipline, especially in military, better than anywhere that I know of. But what's really lacking in simulation is again the non-kinetic side of the equation. And I think that this system gives you specific definitions and cases of the actual strategies being used in the influence side of some matter or scenario that you're trying to simulate. So I think it's a very, very important thing there to advance, ways to figure out and practice war games. The second is that it gives you, just as we've done with the Decoding Crimea piece, it gives you a basis for literally illustrating the plays, the influence strategies that bad actors are running. And you can do that by aggregating those strategies that you decode. That's primarily the method we've used in this paper. Or you can plot them along a timeline, which gets very interesting because then you can start to see how the nature of some program or campaign evolves, what plays are being run up front, which plays are being used a little later on, which plays aren't being used, which plays tend to get bunched together because sequences and series and constellations of plays as coded can be very telling. You can sort of see a batch or a cluster of things happen in sort of spasmodic patterns, and that can tell you something. So in other words, you can use the system to map. So there's simulation, there's mapping. I think that what's really become pretty clear, and very much to my surprise, is that military intelligence really, they don't yet have a very well developed lexicon for this art that they're studying so closely. As I said a little while ago, the play called decoy is like a ruse or a red herring. But I don't think that there is a contrasting or comparable term for a challenge or for a bait or for a contrast. I did a study a little while ago and which showed, at least to my satisfaction, that only about 25% of the plays in my system are known and reflected and specifically defined in the various dictionaries of military terms. So I think military is very underdeveloped in understanding the irreducibly unique units of influence. And so I think it can be offered up as a transcendent, as a cross-functional whole of military lexicon for understanding in a standardized way the moves and the counter moves of actors, good and bad. And then at last, I think that there's a big opportunity here now to begin to automate this. The conventions for machine learning, for artificial intelligence, lend themselves to this system. And we can talk about this a little bit if you wish, but right now at the Playmaker Systems at my company, there is a pilot project in progress that has been able to harness machine learning algorithms and to automate right now about a third of the system. So in other words, we're figuring out how to push content, English language-based content right now, though it could be of a different language. And from that, we can derive what I call strategy signatures. I was thinking about Vladimir Putin's, big annual multi-hour press conference that happened this week. And a few years ago, I took his content and I ran it through the system, and I was able to look at patterns to figure out on which topic is he shading, on which topic is he pressing, on which one is he confident. You can take these situations and overlay them either automatically or through human coding and start to get literally a picture of the motive, not just the message, but the motive behind actors and their rhetoric.
Yeah, you touched on this just briefly, but I think to make it explicit, it sounds like literally any bits of information can be plugged into this taxonomy. So something that comes across a news channel or a social media post or a government document, anything that communicates could be cataloged and then analyzed to be part of a strategic communication campaign. Mm-hmm. Do we have that right?
Yeah. You're familiar with the music app called Shazam. There might be better ones now, but you're sitting in a restaurant, not lately, but you hear a song you like, and you hold up the thing and you say, what tune is that? And it tells you, oh, well, that's Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, whatever. That tells you what the song that is.
We're recording this on December 18th, 2020. Everybody's in the Christmas spirit.
That's right. Thank you. But there are programs that will tell you that can recognize songs, which are highly subjective, abstract stuff. But they're able to reduce it into, digital signatures. Well, what this proof of concept platform, it's called Spindex, shows the promise for doing is just that, is that I could hold up, my figurative mobile or smartphone and say, what play is John running right now? And it could listen for a minute or two. It'll say, oh, well, he's running a filter. He's running a decoy. He's running a peacock. He's running a ping in these various concentrations. That tells me a whole lot more than just simply the words that John wants to communicate to me. It tells me more about the play that he's running, maybe on me or with me. So that could be enormously helpful. We see also no reason why this couldn't be done in other languages, so that you can hold up a phone to a Russian speaker, let's say, and know, without having to actually know or understand that language, the plays that the Russian actor in this case is running.
Yeah, I can definitely see how this would be useful. So I'd like to wrap up. I always try to ask the Cognitive Crucible guests if they could recommend a book or two that interested listeners can go and check out if they're especially jazzed about this kind of conversation space. Do you have anything that you could recommend?
There's one I think that people ought to be reminded of, and it's Wargaming for Leaders. It was written by some of the Booz Allen gurus there, and I think the primary author, Mark Herman. who's a mentor of sorts of mine, really lays out how wargaming works. And I use this to understand how to do simulations correctly, and then how to overlay and begin to beef them up or enhance them in terms of the influence or information aspects. But wargaming for leaders, to me, is like the Bible on wargaming and simulation. And another one, which is it's the smallest book in my library, physically, literally, and about the funniest. And it's called Gamesmanship, The Theory and Practice of Gamesmanship by Stephen Potter. And it's who's a Brit, and who talks about what we are talking about here, but in terms of sports. And he uses a lot of tennis and ping pong analogies, like if you stop for a minute and you adjust your socks. and you keep doing that, you develop a tick to annoy a particular player. My father was a sailor, and he was always doing things to psych out, other sailors in the races that we did. And so this is sort of a simple, small book about the art of psych out and what Stephen Potter calls gamesmanship. But I can look through any of these games that Stephen Potter describes, and I can tell you the influence strategies that are behind them. So I think it's a really fun way of animating what is, for this audience, a very, very serious business, but putting it in very fun and sort of entertaining terms.
That is brilliant. And with that, Alan Kelly, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you very much for having me.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.